Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our special edition of an author Q&A with Qin Sun Stubis. So glad that you all are here and so glad that we have the honor of having Qing here. We really enjoyed reading her book, Once Our Lives. In our book club last week, we just had a really great conversation about that. Um, Qin Sun Stubis is a Washington, D.C. based writer, poet, newspaper columnist, and the author of award-winning historical epic slash memoir, Once Our Lives. As you know, this book is the amazing true story of four generations and the author's family as they struggle to survive some of the greatest historical events of the 20th century, as well as an eerie superstition that seemed to hold her family in its power for nearly 100 years. This book has won many awards and much praise. It was named the gold winner in the International Nonfiction Book Awards, the #1 winner of the Pencraft Book Awards for literary excellence in culture and history, the first place winner of the Nellie Bly Awards for journalistic nonfiction, and a winner of both a Best Book Award and a Reader's Favorite Book Award. Finally, Ms. Magazine and Glamour Magazine UK chose Once Our Lives as a top read, and it debuted on Amazon new release for 41 days at #1. So welcome. Welcome to Memoir Mentors, Ching. Just a quick thing about Memoir Mentors. We've been meeting since 2020. This is our 5-year anniversary this year. And we have a book club that we choose different books, all different types of books from people all over the world, all memoirs, and we have conversations about the memoirs in a craft-focused discussion because we're all writing our memoirs ourselves. So our conversation today will be kind of geared towards that. We also have some questions about your past and your experiences, but we will mostly be focusing on the literary, on the craft side of things. So thank you so much again for joining us. Um, First off, I wondered, Once Our Lives spans 4 generations and it includes so many richly imagined scenes from times before you were born. And I wondered, how did you navigate the boundaries between memory, family, lore, and fictionalization? And how did you learn these stories from your ancestors?
Well, first, I want to thank you, Christina, and for having me. And I want to thank all the authors here. And I know that this is a very wonderful opportunity, and I really feel flattered to be here because being with the writers is always a special feeling because I know that we share the sentiment, and a memoir is a very unique writing. It's not fictional, it's not scientific, and it's just filled with stories of the past. And whether we have experienced or whether we have heard from our relatives, from our intimate, close members of the family, or we ourselves have witnessed or experienced. You know that our memory is a very unique thing, how we remember things. In a room setting, for instance, just today's meeting, everybody is here, and then when the whole event is over, and then we set out to write and report about this particular event, I'm sure what we choose to remember, what is important to us, will become the highlight, and some parts may be muted. So as a result of it, everybody's memory is from our unique perspective. And in that regards, I feel that it's not a sense of right or wrong, but how we put our perspectives all together that will form a whole picture. And the other day I was talking with a friend and I was joking about it. I said, imagine history, particular history, with an apple. And everybody that lives through the history would contribute a slice of it, maybe very thinly sliced. How we all put together will make it into an apple back together again. So, but if nobody does anything, then it would become a ghost apple and it would disappear. It may haunt you, but it would not really show itself. So if you know a particular story, a historical thing, and you do not write about it, it's almost it's negligence on our part that we did not take it as our duty or responsibility to share it to the world. Now, we are maybe not perfect, and nobody is, but it's so important, especially when you have the time. A lot of people have excuses and never have time. I'm so
Hmm.
busy doing this, I'm so busy doing that. And that, but is it? What is important? Like if your best friend is sick, you would drop everything to go to see that friend, make that pot of chicken soup. So that's to me what history was. Now, I feel very blessed in a sense that I happen to have a memory almost like a photographic
Oh, lucky
because
you.
uh, because you know what happened was even my mother-in-law when she was alive, when I talk about a certain events she chose not to remember, she always say, "Curse your memory!
Oh,
Why are
wow.
you remembering it?" But as good things as bad things, they would come to us, and it's so important. I mean, I try to not hold a grudge and revenge on anyone, but somehow I have a problem about forgetting what had happened to me. And I guess some of the things that you read are dramatic, and some of them are traumatic. And a lot of the things really was not up to us. In some ways, growing up, I always felt like being a child forever because I had a little control
Mm.
about what was going to happen to me. So, how do I navigate the boundary? Um, in a way, I was very lucky because of my memory. And also, I felt very lucky my mother was a storyteller. Growing up poor meant we had very little stimulation. Like, of course, in the 1960s in China, there was not such a thing as a television. The only thing we had was a radio, which was very crudely made. My father had enough money to buy the parts, the components. And one of his friends assembled and then put a wooden box outside it.
Mm.
And when my mother had the money to buy the batteries, and it was not often working, she really had to hit it. And then suddenly it got connected and we could listen. So, other than that, we didn't even have money for electricity often. So, by 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock at night, the lights were not turned on. And my mother would have hushed us to go to bed. And my older sister and I shared one quilt. So we would tuck together, head to toe, hug each other, and go to sleep. And we share each other's warmth. Now, children would not want to go to sleep. So my mother used her ability. She would tell us stories. When we were little, the stories were simpler, they were more positive. As we grew older, the same story started to extend into details and often not so pleasant, but
Hmm.
it catered to our ages, so we would not freak out about them. I often fell asleep listening to my mother's voice. And so when my parents were gone, when I was in my 40s, I was so sad, sad beyond belief, because I never had many people around me besides books, besides my family. So my little son, who was only 7, told me, he said, "Mom," he said, "they never really gone. If you close your eyes and can think about them, or when you go to sleep and you dream about them, they will come back to
Hmm.
you." And indeed, listening to a child's innocent voice, I felt when I closed my eyes and then my parents would come back to me, along with my 3 little sisters, almost like a movie unreeling in front of me. And the stories of our lives, the stories my mother told me, and they kind of as real as can be.
So is that when you knew that you wanted to write this book?
I felt I wanted to. I had an urge that my children would know about their grandparents. I didn't really think further than that. That was my thought. The kids should know the American life is too good. They would never understand what
Hmm.
I had gone through. So I tried on a computer and I discovered it was impossible for me to think and type at the same time. For anyone who grew up with another language, I was 29 when I immigrated to America. And I felt that I couldn't think and write at the same time. So I had little notebooks and a pen. I also didn't have the time, so I carried a notebook and a pen in my bag. When my children went for clarinet lessons, ballet lessons, tennis lessons, I would sit and I would try to think about and I would write them in notebooks. So actually, I have accumulated a pile of notebooks
Sounds
that
familiar.
filled with the original story, very, very crude stories. And late at the night, when I had time on my own, I started to type them into computers. And that was how I started out with my book.
Did you know when you started writing things down that you wanted to write this book? Or were you just
I
writing as journaling to start with?
I was writing short stories in a
Okay.
sense, as each of my chapter you could see concentrates, focus on very specific little stories. And so that's what I did. I ended up having a pile of stories.
Hmm.
Now, as you all know, it took me 20 years to write. So the writing process was long. The emotion was pure. I never had a thought about making up anything. I felt as my mother was talking to me, the stories. And I think as writers and memoir writers, when you think about those past events, the happenings, whoever told your story might have a little voice in your head telling you the stories. And that's as real as we can to bring our past back to the present. The boundary is our memory. What is our memory?
I guess when I asked, when I said fictionalization, this is something that is kind of murky territory because I know that you were writing a true story,
Mhm,
but I'm sure that even in those stories that your mother told you,
mhm,
it couldn't be nearly as rich, as detailed as the stories that you have written in the book. And we
mhm,
all, as memoirists, it's just actually, I think you have to change. You have to change certain things like dialogue, for example. You can't write dialogue as it actually happens or it sounds ridiculous. And so you've also got kind of some the inner lives of your
mhm,
ancestors in this.
mhm,
And I just wondered, how did that feel to step back into those
mhm,
ancestors' shoes and to imagine what they would have felt
mhm,
like? And how did you put that
mhm,
into your story?
mhm. Well, history is a very interesting thing. Living with my mother for about 29 years of my life, repeatedly hearing her saying the same stories so many, many times. Now, each time the conversation, the little things was slightly different. The same way as I hearing my grandmother talking about a beggar's visit. And, so she was an illiterate woman. So it was every time she said something, it's almost like a bring so many meaning stories together, so many, many versions. But understanding who my grandmother was, her past, understanding who my mother was and my father was, living with these figures for decades of my life, I felt that I was qualified in a sense to step into their shoes and portray who they are. Main thing about a memoirist is how to be objective. Because had you known how much I hated my grandmother, for instance, for all those years, for neglecting me, saying horrible things to me, which I did not really say in the book because they were irrelevant. What was relevant was the story itself, and it's about her life or what she went through. And that's why I was merely a character in the book. The book was not about me. It was about 4 generations of Chinese women when going through a life, going through the social changes. So I would say, yes, some of the conversations may not be exactly how the words appeared throughout the years, but how to combine those things together. Unless you had your mother, I know that a lot of Americans would do those interview like history. Have your mother or father sit down with you, asking questions, make them talk. But even when they say to you, their conversation they had with their parents may not be exactly the words they used at the time. But I think it is important, I always thought about one book I particularly adore is Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. He was very pungent. He used a lot of interesting words and languages, and but really what helped was bringing a period of history, a family's life in front of you. And I really felt that I knew Angela. I knew Frank McCourt as a child. And I felt that was more important because we cannot write, even if we write very boring dialogues that readers still then, I mean, are they exactly the words that are echoing
No.
within the walls at the time? So yes, to be a memoirist, it's very hard. To me, being objective is the most important thing. How not to put your perspective as the only perspective. How to stand in other people's shoes when you portray them as characters. And
Were
I
you a
think
big,
yes.
I was just going to ask, so were you a big fan? You mentioned Angela's Ashes. Were you also a fan of other memoirs before you started writing one, or what type of books do you normally read?
I read all sorts of books. Being an English major when I was 19 years old, imagine wearing the clothes your mother hand sewed, wearing the shoes, even the sole of the shoes my mother made exactly the way I described in the book. Because I saw my mother making those things forever, for the entire my life. Knitted my sweater, did everything. I was really a handmade Raggedy Ann doll when I went to college. And then suddenly exposed to a different language, English, and found works by Shakespeare, Chaucer, Spencer, Milton, Charles Dickens, you name it. It was quite, it's like a Dorothy opening, like landed in the Oz or something. But I embraced everything and I turned, growing up to become a very romantic person. I felt the Jane Austen, all those things, Jane Eyre. They inspire the world that I would wish that I would be in. So I would say that my writing is probably reflects who I am. And even though I did not grow up in that world. So there's some sort of aching and longing, there's sort of ultra romantic sadness. When I was writing the book, I was writing with tears and laughter as I was writing it, facing my reality, the life that I lived, the stories that I heard. Somehow, if you're being a memoirist and if you're writing and you're laughing and crying at the same time, I think you're doing the right thing. That's what I feel like. Yes, you're doing right. Continue. But if you're writing something, you feel that you're not emotionally there, then you better catch that emotion before you put your pen on the paper. That's what I feel.
Yeah. I understand that you're writing a historical fiction now, and I wondered if you, when you started writing this book, if you considered writing it also as a historical fiction.
Um, Actually, the reason I didn't, because the book was dedicated to my parents. I think that all the stories that are put in there, my mother told me the stories, or I lived through them. Mostly, those are the two orientations. Although I did try to give the readers a perspective in the very, very, very beginning of the book, before I started on my chapters, I did write, as far as I know, everything in this book is true. The stories, as hard to believe as some of them may be, happened to me personally or were told to me by the people who lived through them. Most of what follows was shared privately, sometimes confidentially, often late at night, in bed, and in hushed whispers. By hearing these accounts repeatedly over the years, as family histories often are, I became convinced that the stories are real, or at least as real to now their long silent witnesses as human beings are capable of ascertaining. Although I was far too young at the time to fully take on the roles asked of me, I became the friend, confidant, and a small ally of all those who told me these tales, especially my mother. It is to her, my strength and to true inspiration, that this book is dedicated. And I think that being a memoir writer, it is important to let the readers know that this is what how I remember the past, but it does not represent 100% how the history actually occurred, because nobody does.
Hmm.
And I could have written it as a fiction if I felt that I was creating characters. I did not create any of those characters, including how my father found the ruby and where he found it, how sick he was. Now, of course, my grandmother gave him a cup of tea. The actual feeling, how my grandmother hid that ruby, and so quietly being so careful because it could have been taken away by the brother-in-law who owned the charcoal store. But the actual conversation, little words, but I had to use it from mother's perspective. How my grandmother was grateful to my father, and how much she believed by the fortune teller that my father had a great fortune, and how my great grandmother, when she was dying, saying that I was a lucky person, everyone's jealous of me. That I did remember.
Hmm.
People's darting eyes at me, they kind of were projecting so much jealousy, as if I felt that the people hated me. And I was so scared. And I remember my mother's words. I remember how she embraced me. And yeah, when I was writing the book, I really felt that my mother, and along with so many other people, they were living inside me. And the voice came out of me was not as words, but as a movie, some
Uh-huh.
sort of things, of films being unveiled from the past.
Interesting.
So, yeah, I felt that sometimes you would sit there. I would wake up at 4 in the morning and get into almost like a trance, as if things just was coming out of me. And then there would be days I would be sitting there and thinking like a log. I
Mhm.
couldn't write
Yeah.
one word of it. And
Did you
then
ever
two
feel like
days,
did you ever feel
yes.
like giving up?
Oh, yeah. It was a long process because English was not my language. And I do know, being a reader and a writer, of course, being a reader is essential. to become a writer, and how many writings inspired me. But being a writer is very, very different. The words come out, the emotion comes out, and sometimes your emotion are the biggest obstacles to your writing. Emotion will wash away logic, sentences, and you get so choked up about certain things that you're just not capable of turning what you see in your head into words. So I really thought that I may not be able to write because the difficulties I went through, that I couldn't somehow express emotions in English. It took me 20 years. During that 20 years, as I was writing short stories, I became a journalist. I started to pen a monthly writing, mostly about 600 words. And they became my exercises.
And were
Just
those stories that you wrote pieces of what went into your memoir, or were they something different?
very, very different. I
Okay.
have written mostly essays about my past and incorporated, with American culture, about my perspective from my culture, about raising a children, being a parent, being a gardener, and taking the dogs out for a walk. I even wrote many columns on my puppy who was adopted from the shelter. And I felt that each time when I wrote an essay, it was a drill. And I think being a memoir writer, don't forget, memoir is quite a big project.
Hmm.
And you think about the most famous painters, as they work on their masterpiece, what do? They actually do sketches. Even the large scale painting, one had a person, they might have that person there, and they started to write, draw sketches in oil, in watercolor, in charcoal of the same head, or a bird, or a horse, many, many times. And I think that so for me, writing, penning down 200, over 200 newspaper columns, and writing short stories and poems, I felt that I started to get very invigorated. And
When you
just,
were when you
yeah,
wrote that, when you wrote your memoir, did you end up with way more pages than you needed? Did you have to take
you,
a lot out?
we all do. There
Hmm.
might be chapters we don't need them.
Hmm.
And there may be words that are overwritten. There might be a paragraph somewhere that shouldn't be there. But that really requires a lot of logic and rationality. As you write a memoir, you are incapable of using that much logic when you're working on your emotional stories. So to me, don't put them together. There would be a different step of your process. When
So
you are
did you
very
write all the way
emotional,
through? Did you write all the way through on one draft and then do the editing later, or did you find yourself
I
going back to doing editing piece by piece?
I actually, what I did was I pretty much write first old stories like chapters, and I name the name of the chapters. And some of the times it's like what I felt quilting. If you guys ever done quilting, have little swatches, and then you kind of generally know the concept, what a theme you want for your quilt, but the exact design and pattern, whether or not you want to put an extra motif on it, you don't know. So that's when you try to figure out what you want to be the beginning and how you want to end it. That's when I started to feel, do I want it to do chronically? Do I want to more using a particular figure first? I realized that after all, a writer's objective is the book is going to be on the market, how we're going to attract readers. What do you think the readers would like to read about first? Not what we want to tell, because otherwise it would just from the beginning to the end. I would have started with maybe the birth of my father instead of putting my grandmother's believe in the very beginning and then started. Oh, I could have started with my mother, but how to put my father in there? How, there are just the many, many ways of doing it. But I feel in this situation, I really needed my father's beginning of his life and my mother's beginning of life. They're like the two eyes of a dragon. You can't have one without the other because both of their lives are just too interesting. But I, in the end, put as a most important character is someone who I hated all my life growing up, my grandmother, who hated girls, who ignored me, who never gave me a present, who never babysat me even though we were 15 minutes away, who always ignored me but telling me a horrible story. They traumatized me so much. I ended up putting her story in the very beginning because I felt that was the I have to have a spine. It's
The frame
almost a
for it.
vertebrae
Mhm.
that I have to. It's like a string to make your necklace
Did you know that you wanted to
sparkle.
do it? When did you just discover that you wanted to use that as kind of the framing device to structure your memoir?
I have already finished all the stories, like you said, overwriting all the pieces of chapters. I left them there and I try to see how I'm going to put it together that will be most interesting to the readers. And I felt that having a wandering spirit haunting her before my father was born, and also going through all the stories, I really realized it's not that my grandmother hated me. My grandmother hated the girls
Mm.
because having four girls without a boy, it broke the only pride the family had, having boys, having their name carried on. By having four girls, the family has lost essentially everything. The roots of the family cease to grow. And all four girls were responsible. She would never think of my father was responsible for it.
Of
Men
course.
are the one to determine. It's the women. It was my father. It was my mother. It was the four of us. So
Did you actually
my
kind of did you
mhm.
realize that previously, or did it take the writing to really help you understand more about your grandmother?
The writing helped me with everything. Even when I left China, right before I left, the night I spent at my mother's house, 10 o'clock at night, my grandmother and my grandfather appeared in the darkness, and my grandmother discreetly tucked a roll of paper money in my hand. And she said, "Buy yourself something." And I looked at her in the darkness. I couldn't see her eyes, but I had so much uneasiness. I did not know what she gave to me. I knew they were money. And from a grandmother who never had given me anything. At the time we were starving, she did not bring me food. When I was shaking with cold, she did not give me a piece of clothing. When I was worried to death of my father, whether he was still alive, she was not there to comfort me. And there I was with a roll of money in my palms. And that night, I opened it. It was about 200 something yuan, which was quite a bit of money at the time. My father's wage was less than 50 a month.
Oh, wow.
Before he was imprisoned, the last sentence, which took away his job. And so he made nothing. I put the money back into my father's palm. I said, "Give to grandmother." I said, It's too late. No stores are open. And I said, I don't need her money now. So I never took anything from her. But it did bring tears to my eyes. I do not know. It was a tear for feeling that finally I got something from my grandmother, or it was more hatred. It was more like, why now?
Mm-hmm.
And so, no, I would probably never have put my grandmother into my life. I feel like my life had nothing to do with my grandmother, even though I always knew my father loved her. I never understood why my father loved my grandmother so much, as she disliked my mother and the four girls in my family.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that if my father loved me, he shouldn't have known that anyone who would dislike us, he should have nothing to do with them. And I grown up, even my college education didn't change that. Coming to America didn't change that. My father died. It did not change that.
Yeah.
Until I looked back, remember my grandmother's story and how the two of them died within virtually, literally an hour or two
Yeah.
within each other. And of course, my grandmother was 19. So my father was very young when he died, but they died together, two generations. And it was very, very hard for me to write the end of the book. So, talking about you had everything together, right? But I avoided. I actually had a poetic ending to the book, the original ending. As I was doing the final publication, as I was doing the final editing, I decided to face the fact how my father died. And I rewrote the ending right before it went to print.
Mm.
Because everything as true to my memory as it could be. I felt that I would have betrayed myself, my words, had I not put a real ending to the book. We all have fears within ourselves, whether things we don't want to, we choose not to remember. And sometimes with the right things, we choose to remember things one way, while as we think about the things, they would come out a different way. And it's hard. Being a memoir writer means we're brave. If everything is pleasant, we might as well write fairy tales, right? There are a lot of things we choose not to touch until we're older, means something was hurting us. Something sometimes hurt us so badly. Once I met a memoirist. She wrote about incest between herself and her father when she was very, very much older. She wrote it. And I really admired her so much, how she wrote about him and how she actually forgave him. And it made me feel like I forgive my grandmother. That's very little comparing with what she wrote and how she decided to forgive her father. So yeah, just as we think that our life is hard, reading a memoir means you find someone else's life could even be harder than ours. And there's nothing wrong with your life or the other people's life. The world, it's about the world. And that's why we are writing. That's why we want the world to know.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully someone one day will pick up our book. They actually will pick up courage as well. You will be surprised. Even if you sell your book, 50 copies of your book, that one of the 50 people might be so affected that you could have changed their life and makes our book well worth writing.
Mm-hmm.
So that is how important everything is.
How did you decide when your memoir was done?
I think when I changed the ending of the book, I knew it was done. You would know it. It's very, very interesting. Writing memoir is our memory and our emotion. It's kind of together. It's so humane. I would say fiction is all about our world of imagination, and sometimes it's like a balloon, a helium-filled balloon, and you put an anchor to it, like a children's birthday party. You would make sure it won't rise too high. You would put a weight underneath, and that weight is the reality. And the balloon is our fiction. That's what I feel like. But for memoir, it is all about what's in our head, the reality, and our emotion all together. And of course, there's a historical backdrop, which you have to make sure, if you have any historical backdrop, you have to make sure you do study that and understand it, and then understand what these people you're writing under the historical backdrop, where their positions are. So the readers would understand it. Now that, when these people live, they may not even understand themselves what the historical backdrop they were living. What was interesting was I suddenly came to a realization when I was putting the historical line on it. I never realized I was born in 1962. The communist China was a very, very young, because it was founded in 1949. It was only 13 years before I was born. I didn't realize it was an infant country.
Mm.
And that also gave me a perspective why China was so turbulent. These leaders finally overthrew the imperial side of China, made it into, first was the Republic of China. It was in the early 1921, talking about Dr. Song Yan's son, the Chiang Kai-shek retreat to Taiwan, 1949. China was so young. I did not see it. I never understood it
Yeah.
until I started to write a memoir. Oh
And
my,
did
my
you add
gosh.
that history, the history portion? Did you add, it works really well in the story. It was, for me, I knew only vaguely about that time period and about what was going on in China then. And this story, your story, really helped me understand it in so much of a deeper way because I saw it through your family's experiences. But I wondered if that historical aspect was something that you added in later, or was that something you knew from the beginning that you wanted to add?
I wanted to minimize politics. As much as a writer, I have never written politics because seeing my father, how he was tortured for being for the revolution and being against the Cultural Revolution at the same time, in his lifetime, it scares me. It traumatized me for life to such an extent. Just give you an example. It took me 14 years to get a driver's license because every time I went to motor vehicle bureau, I freak out. Every time there was a representative sitting in my car as I did my road test, I freaked out. I freak out so much that there is a stop sign right next to me and I know it's there. I would dash it through because my heart was in my throat. All I wanted is get out of it. I want to run away from the car. It took me 14 years before I was able to pull myself through it. And so I have decided, even though I wrote in newspaper, even though I write short stories, I want to use politics, social events more as a backdrop, but I'm not going to paraphrase it like Victor Hugo loved to do, like a whole chapter. I used to drive me crazy reading his books in Chinese because there's a whole chapter of it. It's talking so much about politics. I, as a child, I mean, I was like 16 years old. I wanted to know what happened to these people. I was not mature enough that I wanted to know about the
Mhm.
French revolution of politics. So I kind of learned my way how to dodge certain sections so I
But
can keep on reading.
you did include a fair amount of history and the political climate, and I felt like that was such an
Mhm.
important part of what happened, and it would have been maybe strange to leave it out. And I think that you did a nice job of including it and educating us through your family's stories. And I wondered if that was something that you did add later, or if that was something that just came naturally as you were writing, that you knew that uh, you needed to provide that backdrop so that we could understand how your family was living and their experience.
Partially, yes. Especially about the 3 years of famine, about how people were dying, what my father witnessed through the story about him meeting the girl. My mother told me that story many times because my father told me her when he was in tears and described about the story. So I felt that if I did not really talk about, no one would understand what was
Mhm.
happening and how those so-called 3 years of famine killed nearly 30 to 50 million people. And so far, I think it's still the largest famine in the world because that was a lot of people that died. And I felt very fortunate that I didn't die. And my mother managed to save our lives, even though I was lying in the crib for the first 2 years of my life. Yes, partially, I was, in a way, forced to talk about it,
Mhm.
not out of my self preservation feelings, but I was forced to talk about it, but I did not criticize anything in a sense because I do not like to comment on politics. I only write to explain. So
And
I
I
think that,
imagine your
yeah,
father's experience with how he was so outspoken, even though it sounded like he actually was just standing up for people he knew, um, but he endured such torture and had so many troubles because of politics. I imagine that had to be really scary for you to write this.
it was very, I felt they died, especially my father's death. I felt the person that I knew versus the person who stayed in the prison was accused of doing so many things did not go together. And I knew that I have no powerful friends who could help me to change that. And how he became a man who was filled with laughter, happiness, and would help anyone, would say anything out of his heart, to become a person who was quiet, a person who I never got to know again after he came out of the prison the second time, ridden with sickness. And I felt I wanted to do something for him. I wanted to know that what I could have done. I couldn't have saved his life, but I have a pen. I'm
Mm.
not as strong as he is because I don't want to go through what he had gone through. But if I don't do it, I felt I fail to be his daughter.
Mm.
So that's the reason I did what I did. It would always be easier to hide somewhere and be a mole, never see the brightness and never see anything. But that, could I call that a life?
Mm.
I can't think so.
You've had a really
So
remarkable life, and I wondered if you've considered writing a memoir that is just about your life?
Somehow I feel that I'm not an important person. I just don't see how I can write about myself. And maybe
But you
someday I
are.
change my mind.
You have such an interesting story. I mean, we learned a little bit about your life, the beginning of your life, but I know that there's so much left untold about how you went to school, how you learned English, and how you
Mhm,
came to the United States. I
mhm.
think that has got to be a really incredible story.
It it was not easy.
Yeah.
I went to one of the most prestigious colleges in China, filled with a lot of very the descendants of very important people, the provincial officials' daughter, the New China press, Xinhua
Mhm.
news agencies, director's daughter. I had so many classmates that were very famous and a lot, and yet I was a person who came from nothing, come from had no money. I relied on the government stipend to live. My mother pretty much told me, had I been told to join a university out of Shanghai city where we lived, she won't have had the money to buy me a train ticket. But I got into a university that happened to be in Shanghai. It was the number two best language universities in China. It was dual run by the foreign ministry and the Ministry of Education. And I had a great time there. I knew that every second I had there, I just felt I was so privileged to be there.
Mhm.
They trained the Chinese, top diplomats and diplomatic people. A lot of people went to UN to work. So I felt I was a very, very, feel like prestige, even though I was nobody. So there was some sort of a panic. Some days you would even have dreams like, so I'm sorry, we sent the notice to the wrong person, and I had to pack up and go back home. So yeah, there was a lot of. I mean, I could write a lot, but I just feel I'm not an important person. So if I don't see myself that
I
other
bet your
people want
children,
to know.
I bet your children think you're an important person. I know your
They
husband thinks you're an
do.
important person.
They do. They're still learning stories about me. Well, my children are doing great. I raised them single handedly when my husband was working. I met this young man at the time who didn't even have a job, but he was a pianist, Juilliard trained classical pianist named Mark. When I first arrived in America, I didn't know what I was doing. I went to Arizona to get a degree because I wanted to come. My father came home from the prison. I felt I raised a family for 7 years when he was in the prison, and it was my time to do something for myself. And since I was a tour guide for the Americans for 7 years, I felt I wanted to see the world. I wanted to see America. So many of them told me, said, America would love you because I recited Shakespeare's sonnets to them. I recited a Daffodil by Wordsworth to them. So, Gettysburg Address. They wanted me to see America. So I applied to become a student and I came to America to be a student. But I didn't know actually the real reason was I had to find really my the rest for someone for the rest of my life
Mhm.
who
Well,
practiced the piano recital for me when I was in Arizona because he missed me. And I was the only person sitting in front of a piano with a program. And even though he had the money, I thought that he was the person for me. And I think now to think back, like I had to go to America to find my sweetheart. That was it.
I
Yeah,
see in
basically, yeah.
the chat Lisa has written, I would like to read that memoir. Yeah.
Oh,
And Carol says this, I found this very inspiring as I write for my children and their children. And so I think that's something that's been so interesting to us when we read this was that it did cover such a broad, such a broad scope. So many of us, when we are writing memoir, we're told that we need to have a smaller scope and just write about one portion of our lives. And I think this was an interesting departure from what we normally read because it covered so much. And I'd be interested to see if someday you might write your story. But back to like this broad scope, um, did you find, how did you really decide what to keep, what to leave out?
I felt longitudinally, time-wise, it was important that I want the world to understand the changes and the things that would never change, that only could be made through history, through decades of life. So that was the reason I felt that in order to understand my mother's, I had to see through my eyes of my mother as well, and see through her eyes of her mother's, how she gave my grandmother gave my mother away like an extra pair of shoes, okay? And how my mother kept all her 4 daughters. But I didn't talk about myself almost being given away.
Yeah,
As a
what
matter of
was
fact,
I'm interested in
uh,
that. I learned in
yeah,
Diane's podcast that you actually were almost given up for adoption. And I,
not only me, actually, later on, my youngest sister also got into the same situation. But my mother, how her attitude changed was quite interesting, which I did not put in the book because the book was getting too long. I
okay.
felt that I really wanted to talk about my father. I wanted to use the world of readers to know his innocence. I want to use the court of literature to prove my father's innocence.
Mm,
That became my main goal
okay.
more than anything. And I think that I had to sacrifice some of the things out, talking about cutting the things out. I wrote a little bit about my adoption and I did not include it. And my younger sister's possible adoption, I didn't even talk about it. My mother actually, you think about, my mother made me to choose, like a 6-year-old child, about my own fate in the end. And she let these people take me away for 6 months where I cried. I did horrible things. I did with things that other children probably would have done. I refused to use the bathroom. And then I would just do it in my own pants because I think I was messed up. Why I'm in this stranger's house. And even though they were really, really nice people, they were so gentle with me. They tried to please me in every possible way. And in some ways, I was probably the only memories of my life when I was a child. I was treated like a princess. And
Mm,
imagine it was the Venice of the East. And they lived on the floor where they could open up the window. And there would be the farmers in the boat in the canal. They would swing by with fresh jumping shrimp and the fish and the vegetables. And they do the transaction right through the window. And they would give me the best food I had in my life. They hugged me, did everything.
mm,
6 months later, I went back to the home with a concrete floor, with nothing to eat. And my mother told me to decide. And the picture in my head, how the lady opened her wardrobe, showing me silk embroidery clothes with bright colors, and told me, if only you would be my daughter, all these things are yours.
mm.
At 6 years old, I told my mother I didn't want to go back. I wanted to stay home. So And then when my youngest sister, who is 6 years younger than me, I remember my mother told me also, we had a neighbor, the neighbor who lived in the fancy apartments, and she was a carter, used to be riding on a horseback with the very, very important Chinese leaders. And during the anti-Japanese war, she didn't have any children. She spoke to my mother about how she had miscarriages. She was a girlfriend of one of the vice premier in China. Very, very famous people I'm talking about. She actually hid their love letters with my mother during the revolution until my father got into trouble. My mother returned everything back to her. She told my mother she wanted to adopt my youngest sister. She said, we're next door. You miss your daughter. She's right there. And I would raise her, and I have all the capacity, everything. My mother said to me a few years later, he dreamed one night that my youngest sister was taken to next door, and she cried so hard in the dream. And she woke up, her pillow was soaked.
Mm.
And she said to herself, I can't give her away. So that was the difference when I was going to be adopted. And she told me to make the decision. But when my youngest sister, she was very determined, no matter how hard everything was, she was not going to give away her daughters. So yeah, there are a lot of stories I could have written, but I felt they would provide what a writer would say distraction more, because I
Mm.
felt that I wanted to follow through. I couldn't write longer. I felt like, when am I going to stop? How am I going to stop now? Also, it was the emotion, you know. So someday I might write those stories as essays. Very interestingly, as you talk about me writing a memoir about myself, I felt I'm too insignificant. However, I have been writing essays, kind of prose maybe is a proper word, about my growing up. And as how I remembered my life was about eating watermelons, about um, different encounters with
The
different
chat,
characters.
the chat is blowing up with people saying, yes, please write these stories. This is a very moving and strange story. I hope you'll write about it. Take all those stories, put them in the next memoir. This is moving me to tears. It's heart-wrenching. Your personal life story is amazing, should be shared with the world. So please, I hope you feel inspired to write it. You are
You guys are
obviously a remarkable woman.
inspiring. You guys are so inspiring. I want to thank all of you that to be here today and listen to me rambling, but I'm really, I'm a very emotional person. Once when I was growing up, worrying about my father, like worrying about things, when I came to America, I felt like I'm a brave woman. I went across the ocean with 2 suitcases, and I left all my savings with my mother because I wanted to make sure she had money, for my father and for my mother. And I also said to myself, I'm a strong person. I shed all my tears back in China. I have no more tears. I'm surprised it was wrong. It was very wrong. And I am as emotional and as I was growing up. I guess I can never be changed. We are who we are.
Mhm.
And I just tell you, this is a very emotional talk. And I felt that your group is a wonderful chapter of sisterhood. And being together and share your inspirations together. And I am sure all of you will finish when you do. And if you ever want to connect with me and let me read your stories and be one of the spectators and readers, you can always reach me. And I'm sure Christina can tell you my email address. And I would love to get in touch with you guys and stay in touch. And if I ever come to Germany, and I would love to meet you guys.
Thank you. Actually, we're all over the world. We meet online.
Okay.
Um, but there's a few of us in Germany. We've got people in England and France and Ireland and the United States. Thank you. That was very generous, and we've definitely loved speaking with you. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask before we wrap things up? And Diane says she's very good about staying in touch. Good, good.
She is fantastic. And I would love to keep in touch with you as well, Christina. And
Yes.
for anyone, you never know if you ever come to United States or visit the DC area. And I'm like really close to DC. We're just a few stops away from Dubon Circle in Washington, D.C. And hopefully by then my children will get their jobs and move out. And one just got his PhD in mathematics, and one just got a master's in museum arts. And yeah, I would have loved to, meet friends from around the world and make you a dinner and do things together and
Very
show you
generous. Thank
around.
you.
Yeah, if I
Oh,
have the time, I would have definitely spent the time. Yes.
and so I think we all agree that you need to write another memoir, and we'll have you back. Write one about
Even
you. You're worth it.
Thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, the book I'm writing right now is not a memoir, but it's also a very important book. It's actually about women, about I actually started out with a short story about a little character. I named her Opal because Opal is a very interesting stone to me. It's not precious, but yet it's a fascinating stone, just as fascinating as the character. I try to put all the plights of being a Chinese woman together from a small mining town, how her father named her Opal, and a family with all sons and wanted a daughter in spite of financial punishment, the penalty. And then yeah, when something bad happened and they would blame her. It was her who brought all the trouble. And how she had to sacrifice her own life to benefit all the boys in the family and betrothed to someone she could have never married to. And she had to run away. And she ran away, and then how her plight accumulated by running away, being a woman, and what she couldn't deliver to the family, forcing her to take the baby girl and run away again to a major city. Now I wrote about it, and then like too far beyond to be a short story. And I also got so emotionally attached to the character. I wanted her to finally get something good out of it by along the way through her eyes and how the readers get to know the changes
How did you
in the
find,
Chinese. Mhm.
did you find that that was easier or harder to write than memoir, historical fiction? I guess this is historical fiction. Do you find that the fiction was easier to write than the memoir?
Much easier because I can turn the switch around. I
Mhm.
can change her life. I can put new characters into, just as when I was a little girl, not little, but a teenager. I always wished, I kind of dreamed of sit on a bamboo chair in our yard. I would wish there would be a white horse with the most handsome prince sitting on it, galloping and to me and just scooping me up to a fairyland and all my sufferings would be over. It
Mm,
never happened, but I always dreamed that it could. So, what I couldn't have in real life, I would have let Opal have it.
well, that's
So,
beautiful.
that give you guys a clue about how the book would end, at
It
least it won't end
sounds like a beautiful
tragically.
story. Um,
Yeah.
Before we go, I was wanting to know if you could share what your publishing journey was like. How did you find your publisher and what was that? How'd that go?
It was not easy. Main thing is never to give up. I think for at least 5, 7 years, I started out experimenting, looking for agents. And then the agent tried to query. I loved my agent. She was wonderful. Um, she queried some major publishers, but nobody wanted my book because they said, so-called, I actually read some of the feedback as well. Memoirs supposed to be written by famous people, first thing. Second of all, they didn't think that they can commercialize my book. They didn't think that I can get enough readers. So they were calculating how many books could be sold. They did not want my book. So then I went on to, at the same time as got rejections, I motivate myself, think about all the writers, famous writers getting rejections and how they kept on trying. So I kept on trying. And I also started to look through independent publishers without any agents because agents need to be paid. Small publishers will not give you any advance. And so you need to look around. I mean, I looked far and wide. And of course, I have stories to tons of things to tell how people wanted to, somebody wanted to rewrite my book in my voice and asked me to pay them the money in order to have the book published. They want to use my voice and to rewrite my book. And I was just laughing about it. And then I received rejection letters filled with grammatical errors and supposed to be from agencies. And that just made me feeling really, really sad sometimes. But in the end, I found this agency all the way in Canada, and it's called a Guernica edition. I thought, like, isn't it perfect? They want to publish my book and Guernica out of all the names. I think that name suits my book. And I really been enjoying the process. It's a very, very small publisher, but they publish like 50 books a year. And mostly because it's in Canada, they publish Canadian authors. And mine was published through called the World Editions. So they do publish books around the world. And the great thing is to have my book published. And I felt that through that journey, we drove from Toronto for the launch of the book to Florida, attending a book award and also the bookstore events all the way to Los Angeles. I did it in Barnes& and Noble at the Grove, which is a ginormous bookstore, and which I learned later on how to buy my own personal microphone because it was just so noisy and it was very hard to talk about it. They promised you a microphone, and when you get there was no microphone. Stories like that. And in Washington, D.C., we have a bookstore called Politics and Prose, where the most famous politicians and even Obama does talks there. And I felt very fortunate that I got to
Did your
hold an event there.
publisher set that up for you, or did you need to contact these places yourself?
I contacted all the places by myself. The thing is, you do have to understand that one day you get your book published, even by the most famous publisher. The more famous they are, the more they have their own build up clientele already. And if you're being a new writer, they're not going to put their market money behind you or any people who would do things for you, mostly not. So you have to do everything. It's like giving birth to a child, the first time mom. Think about learning how to put on a diaper, feed a baby, take the stroller, walk the baby, wash the baby. You have to, if you consider the amount of work you put in your book, The book is important like a child. You can do your best to give a lot of TLC to your book. That's what I discovered. And don't forget, you are the best advocate. No one knows your book, knows your baby better than yourself. So I think it's important. Now, when you go to a independent publisher, then they have very little money for the advertising. They were very supportive. I went to California for my first event for small independent book conference, and my publisher actually donated 20 copies and also paid half of the expenses. So I paid half and they paid half. So never, be afraid to ask. The
Mm.
worst you're going to get is a rejection. And also think about paying all the money. I mean, right now we use quite a bit of for personal expenses, travel and everything. Think about it. Normally we would use money to travel, and now I'm just using that money, saving the money to travel for my book, traveling with my baby and having an adventure. And also, don't forget the libraries. Go to the libraries and fill out a form. I want this book. So, what you guys can do for me, go to the libraries. Doesn't matter in France, in England. I have my book in Botswana. Turkey, Turkey actually has about 12, 15 copies of my books in their university libraries. You would be surprised. You ask for a copy of book, they would get it for you. If you have a copy book published, give the name to me. I can ask for a copy right here in Washington, D.C. And also find your friends who belong to libraries. If your libraries or any cultural groups would hold book events for you, and if you can find a couple of them, maybe worth the trip. You know what I mean? So you will be surprised a lot of things you can do. Also, for those of you who purchase the book through Amazon, you can rate and review my book. And the rate and review book is a wonderful thing because a lot of the people look at the rates and reviews, how many stars, and they actually read your review and they would decide whether or not they will buy your book. So someday, if you guys don't want to talk about the marketing, I can talk about a lot, even just on marketing alone, about in general, doesn't matter what books you write, but there are a lot of things you guys can do just to talk about the, funniest thing I want to share with you guys. I think it would be very motivational and inspirational. I got one book award and called the Reader's Favorite. It's a pretty big book award around the world. And I went to Miami to attend the award ceremony. And it was wonderful. They had a stage filled with roses. When the event was over, everybody was allowed to take the roses, taking pictures. They have special people to present you awards, and they had the inspiration talkers. There was one guy named Eddie, and he was the funniest guy. He talked about how he wrote a book and how to sell his own book. He was essentially like a guy who would knock on your door and try to sell your dictionary. He said once he went to a funeral to talk about his friends giving a speech, a eulogy, and went from eulogy, ended up talking about his book. Ended up that he sold like 50 copies of book at a funeral.
Oh my gosh.
And
That's an
he,
interesting marketing
yeah,
scheme.
what he said is that no matter what you do, you can meet some stranger anywhere and people talk about things. Don't forget talk about that I'm a writer and I'm working on this book or have published a book, and find what you call a catchphrase, something like within a minute you can tell people. The shorter, the better. What you can tell people about your book. People say, "Oh,
Hmm.
you wrote a book, a historical memoir. What is it about?"
Yeah, the
So,
elevator pitch is important.
yeah, very, very important. And you have to practice at home with
Hmm.
your friends, with your spouse. Just say it to yourself in front of the mirror. If you don't have that, then people, how can people be interested in your book? And then people start to ask questions, and then you will give some details. And then when that happens, you already have a way to selling a book. So there are a lot of very simple ways where you can sell book. You attend a birthday party,
Mm-hmm.
you go somewhere, attend an event, you're sitting at a bar with a stranger. Don't forget there's an opportunity there. The person next to you just might be your reader.
I love that. I
Yeah,
love that. And I love what you said about how important it is that we be our own advocates. We're running out of time, but I want to thank you so much for the wisdom you've shared, for the moving words you've shared, and I really do hope that you write another memoir. And we're looking forward to looking for your historical fiction when that comes out.
thank you so much.
Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
rest of your day, and until we meet again.
Yes, we will meet. May fate decide